Здравствуйте, дорогие друзья.
Good day, dear friends. My name is Alexander Grek,
Я главный редактор журнала
and I'm
«Популярный».
editor-in-chief of Popular Mechanics magazine.
Поговорим с вами
And today we're talking on an exciting subject, how the lockdown has affected, how COVID-19 has affected our little world. I have three amazing speakers for you today that I think will share with you their enthusiasm.
Саймон из Австралии
So Simon from Australia
мы научились выживать на
will tell us how we have learned to survive in our apartments.
Мэри Энн из Соединенных
The
Штатов.
beautiful Marianne Snow from the US
Как мы научились
will tell us how we have learned to adapt
на работе.
to these conditions at work. And Alexander Kamenev from Moscow will tell us how our urban environments are transforming to adapt to the situation. I think this is going to be very interesting.
Начнет нашу дискуссию Саймон.
And I'll begin with a question to Simon Kessenmacher,
Demographics Group, как я сказал,
director of the Demographics Group from Australia, and he will tell us
привычки людей во время
how people's habits have changed over the pandemic,
замкнутых. Саймон.
when we're forced to live in small enclosed apartments.
Thank you. I'll quickly share my screen to answer this question. We changed our habits quite significantly during COVID, and of course in Australia we live in a big country with a lot of space available, and Australians tend to live in even larger homes than Americans do. So you see a typical Australian house here, and whenever there was a major event in Australia's past, it can be seen in how we change our living arrangements. For example, in the 1950s and 60s, we saw a big wave of Italian migrants coming to Australia, and they realized that Australians up to this point lived in English houses. And they said, why are you living in English houses? You live in a Mediterranean and an Italian climate. That's silly. How about you introduce more indoor, outdoor living spaces? And so the alfresco was becoming a commonplace in all the Australian houses. About 13 years ago, we had what we call in Australia the millennium drought, a massive drought where you weren't allowed to fill your swimming pools, where you had water restrictions, and then everybody put water tanks into their gardens. And so now these remain with us in the homes today. And so, like those two past examples, we already will see change reflected in the Australian home because of the COVID pandemic. We had a big boom of veggie gardens where people used their small backyards to start planting vegetables. And so once a thing like this is in place, we can assume, hopefully, that these habits continue and that those veggie pets don't lie dormant. Of course, there are also other usages. We included much more storage. Australians took to hoarding a bit more food inside the home just in case. So they are transforming some parts of the kitchen spaces into storage units. By now, nobody parks their car in the garage anymore. The car lives in front of the garage, and the garage is turning into home gyms. They are turning into additional storage units because many functions that we were used to do outside of the home are now taking place in the home. So we are reinventing the way that we use our living spaces. And of course, probably the biggest change, and you can see this behind me, by now, we had about half of the Australian population work from home at the heights of the lockdowns, at least in our lockdown capital cities. And so everybody now has a Zoom room, a study at home, a separate room with a door to keep the kids and the cats out of the business calls. And that becomes even more pressing for families where we've seen essentially all families in Australia at some stage homeschooling. Schools went online. And so then the kids went to their separate bedrooms. They had their iPads or laptops or whatever to operate on. The parents worked from home. So all of a sudden, everybody was at home, but everybody was separated at home to live in their own digital bubbles. And a home ideally tries to enable this. It's not always possible. If you live in an apartment, you can't add space. And so this is why we saw a big wave of people in Australia, the millennial generation, leaving apartments. And they left the inner city apartments and they moved to suburbia. They even moved to regional Australia, where 3 or 4 bedroom homes, family-sized homes, were available and they were also affordable. And so these trends we are now here to last, because millennials are now, they're now placing their roots in their new cities, and this is where they will stay. The big question, of course, that we're always asking is how many of these changes will remain? Some of those COVID changes, of course, will be superfluous, you would say, once the pandemic is a thing of the distant past. And in order to answer this question, how many of those changes will remain, I want to show you proxy data. We have no data set that can actually tell us what is going to happen, but we can look at a bizarre data set to estimate what's going to happen. I'm showing you here the share of Australian retail that is taking place online. 2% of all retail sales in Australia as of 2013, this is when we started collecting this data in 2013, 2% of all retail took place online. By February, March 2020, just before the pandemic hit, we reached around 6.5%. Because retail includes gasoline, includes mattresses and whatever. There's lots of stuff in there. So it's only at 6.5%, not very big. But then if we drew a straight projection, essentially, we said by now we'd have 7.5% of all retail taking place online. But that's not what happened in Australia. We, of course, lived in a country with lots of lockdowns. So immediately, as of April 2020, lots of Australia went into some sort of first soft, easy lockdown. And then online retail sales shot up to 11%. Doesn't sound like much, 6.5% to 11%, but every percentage point is $7.5 billion. It's tons of money that shifts from brick and mortar stores to online. Then by Christmas 2020, so last Christmas, Australia was open again, no more lockdowns. And you would expect that then all of those habits revert back to normal, but they didn't. We reached a new plateau, a new normal, because Australians learned new habits. Many Australians for the first time purchased stuff online. They first opened an Amazon account, an eBay account. Online supermarket shopping became a real big thing here. And now people took to this. And so that's the new level. That's the new status quo. Then, of course, in Australia, the virus got worse, and Sydney and Melbourne, the 2 biggest cities, were in lockdown. Then those numbers of online retail sales shot up again. But what I'm showing with this chart, and what I want to make here, the point that I want to make is that we are reaching a new normal. When you have in Australia, it's 25 million people living under extreme circumstances for 2 years, probably a bit more before it comes to an end. Some of those habits will stick. Before the pandemic, 5% of Australians worked from home. At the height of the pandemic, 50% of Australians worked from home. The new normal will not be 5%, it will not be 50%. My best bet would be it is around 15% on any given day that work from home. So the need for Zoom rooms, the need for a home that is flexible enough to have people working from home, that is the new normal. And so that's, of course, the status quo in Australia. And in Australia, different cities were under different restrictions. So we would expect that Melbourne, where I'm from, which was the city in the world with the longest lockdown, they will have more people taking to the working from home movement or habit more seriously and in a more permanent way. Whereas a city like Brisbane in Australia, they didn't have any restrictions. So the demand for working from home, the demand to moving to a new type of house because of this, that'll be very small.
Well, спасибо, Саймон, за интересный.
Thank you very much, Simon, for your exciting story.
Видно, мы в России знали что-то заранее.
Well, indeed, we must have foreseen something in Russia, so we haven't covered our orchards. We still have them. We still have our gardens. So the next speaker is Marianne Snow, speaking from the US. She's the CEO and founder of the Remote Nation Institute, and she's going to tell us today how our behavior has changed at work, how COVID has changed our working habits, and lots of more and more interesting things. Marianne, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. It's so nice to join you today. Good morning, everyone. So, as Simon mentioned, there was a clear change in work habits that happened overnight. And one of the things that I want to emphasize for many people in the United States, there's been a reluctance to participate in things like virtual conferencing, video conferencing in the past. Even though there's been a big shift to a globalization in the US economy, I think that Americans really didn't necessarily take to these types of environments in many cases. And yet in March of 2020, the US went through a series of lockdowns that had a major impact. And so we were working with companies that had never even considered flexible work. Many of them had never adopted video technology. And yet overnight, they were sending thousands of workers home. In the United States, about 40% of our economy went virtual, and they went virtual pretty much overnight. Because of that, video conferencing was suddenly part of everyone's existence. But unlike what Simon was talking about, where he was mentioning separate Zoom rooms, a good majority of the United States was shifting to virtual conferencing, but we were doing it a little bit differently, where suddenly you had individuals who were battling for space within their particular residential urban living spaces. And we were seeing people's pets, we were seeing people's children, we were seeing a lot of people's lives. And so we saw a big shift in how people were integrating their work lives and their personal lives. And suddenly there was a type of mixing that hadn't happened before. And so even though we had circumstances where people might occasionally, when they were working as a traveling professional, be involved with some sort of distance connection, suddenly you had people wholesale moving into video environments. Ironically, in the United States, because many companies had multiple locations and were dispersed or distributed teams anyway, this was one of the first times that we saw companies acknowledging that a dispersed team or a distributed team could come together in new and innovative ways. And so you have teams of people who were moving into video conferencing, and suddenly someone who worked outside of a company's home office would be recognized in ways that they hadn't been recognized before, because just like we're coming together in this video environment, we had teams of people who were coming together and looking at new ways of collaborating with each other. And so this was really a major shift that happened in the US. To Simon's point, you know, how much of a change has happened, how much has impacted people's behavior, how do we see things shifting in work environments in the future? In the United States, we've seen some of the trends that Simon has mentioned. Many people have moved out of urban centers, and offices have stayed empty for a good portion of 2 years. The real estate market, the consumer real estate market versus the business real estate market has shifted dramatically. And so one of the things that we're seeing is in urban centers like New York, like Boston, like Chicago, rents are actually going down for the very first time. Retail spaces are going down for the first time, but also living spaces are going down for the first time in many, many years. Because to Simon's point, we're also seeing an urban flight where people are leaving some of those urban centers. We think that a couple of things are going to happen. Our research, first of all, says in the United States that many of the companies that had not engaged in virtual work or any sort of flexible work before are going to feel the pressure from their employees, because employees have had a taste of what it means to be able to work from a more flexible arrangement where they're actually sitting in their houses. And so they're putting a lot of pressure on their employees. I was actually with a client group yesterday where there's a great deal of employees' dissatisfaction at the moment because their employees are pushing their leadership to make a shift to work from home options or flexible work options. And that's something that the senior executives in many American companies are grappling with. They are having a very difficult time thinking about making that shift. And yet the employees themselves are voting with their feet, and they are literally leaving their jobs and looking for more flexible options, which will allow them to be able to make these changes. We're also seeing that in the United States, accommodating some of the virtual technologies requires a lot of bandwidth. So whether we're talking about video conferencing or possible ways that people are going to get together in the future, whether that involves something like a virtual reality environment, an augmented reality environment. The United States is playing catch up right now on some of our infrastructure, and also making sure that the infrastructure that's in place can be enabled not just in urban centers, but also in rural centers, so that as we're starting to come together in these virtual environments, that we actually have the framework, the infrastructure framework to be able to manage these types of interactions. But the pressure is on for American businesses. The labor force is asking for more flexibility. There's an appreciation of the ability to be able to have more flexibility in your work schedule and also your workplace. We're seeing a rise in co-work spaces, hoteling spaces, where people are coming for short periods of time. We're also seeing a rise in a hybrid work environment where people are going into an office setting for a day a week or 2 days a week, but they have flexibility for the rest of their week. And we're also seeing a big shift in how people are thinking about urban centers, right? You know, what's going to be a business space in the future versus what's going to be a living space in the future. And in those urban centers, how is that going to impact? How is that going to impact how people live and how people are going to be doing work in the future? And so we are definitely seeing a shift in how people are thinking about things in the workplace. And yet, I would also say that many American businesses are still struggling with the potential options, but the labor force is going to push them towards more flexible work.
Спасибо, Мариан.
Thank you, Marianne. It was quite captivating indeed. It seemed to me that Russia is closer to the US, but I really like the Australian approach.
И я на
I like
всякий...
the Australian approach, too.
Я на
I
всякий
think the
случай уже...
alfresco. Simon, I'll come
Yeah.
and work in your alfresco area anytime.
Окей.
You're more than welcome. More than welcome to stop by.
И я на всякий случай уже...
And just in case, I bought a virtual reality headset.
Окей.
I think you should, because I think it's not too, I would say that with some of the technology changes we've seen, I think virtual reality is not too far from what's going to happen next.
Наш следующий...
So our next speaker is Alexander Kamenev, head of artificial intelligence for cities consulting bureau Strelka, and he will give you an idea about adoption and how entire cities are adapting to this situation. Over to you, Alexander. Thank you. And I would like to follow up our discussion in terms of technologies, and I would like to expand it to the city scope, and let's take a look at what technological trends we see, what technological trends have been built over last 24 months. And to start with, I would like to say that when we are talking about cities, we mean two things. First, it's an answer to a question how to build a city. And here we talk about architecture, engineering, construction or building. It's a hard thing. But the next question is, what does city want? It's all about urbanistics, the area that we actually focus on. This is our expertise. So I'm going to talk about the second thing, but first I would like to mention that the technological idea that a machine can somehow manage the environment is not something new. Everything has been designed 50 or 60 years ago, and you can see it in the image how experiments in MIT took place when a robotics arm was managing the environment with metal cubes, and there were some mice that were changing the environment, and then this robotic arm was rebuilding this environment to the initial stage. So we see that this idea is being supported right now. So first, what we want to see and what architects are scary of is a movement towards generation planning. A couple decades ago, we tried to use robotics approaches for city planning, for house planning, for flat planning. Now we can take an image from just a small snippet of text and get an idea of what is in the image. So second, the city management approach in general, when we have distributed cities, and sometimes there are people who don't reside in those cities, but they work in these cities, and cities are changing as well. And the way we saw city planning is a shift from big printing documents to platforms that allow you to promptly react to any changes in the city environment. So now we can do it faster, we can introduce changes in a faster way, we can do it in real time, online, very operationally. Of course, during the pandemic, one of the most important trends is ecology. This trend is really big because people tend to choose places where they are going to live, because you can finally work remotely. So this gave an impetus to data analysis of satellite image analysis, analysis of ecological state of cities in terms of air pollution, water pollution, and this is a new priority for those who are looking for a new home in our new reality. At the same time, When we are exploring cities, we don't have a chance to go to a particular city, even if we are in the same country. It is very difficult to do. That's why we're talking about social media listening. So we analyze social media in order to understand some key queries or key questions about cities or regions, and this allows you to build some idea about your future living space. So when the pandemic hit, we have explored several key cases. We couldn't go abroad. That's why we have designed this methodology in order to understand what different cities are talking about, what their people's needs are in terms of social media. On the other hand, during the pandemic, another trend has become popular, namely real estate management. As far as I know, in the United States, there is a real boom on automated estimate of real estate, of properties. Given that lots of offices became empty, we need to do something with them. So computer vision technologies are applied in order to analyze your view out of window. This computer vision allows you to assess the arrangement, and this is a new paradigm of how we can work with real estate. Business is changing too, of course. If we're talking about city business, we see that a mixture of computer vision and GIS analysis is being employed in order to see where people are, where they go, and what locations people are residing. And this allows us to build routes of people movements and to get some spatial data for predictive analytics in order to understand where to put retail, where it is better to put retail, where it's better to put some touristics places or accommodation or hotels. So in general, this allows you to understand what places are more intense in cities, what places are used for work, and what places are left empty. And what about community? Community has become stronger, as it seems to me. I'm talking about city communities. And digital involvement tools such as crowdsourcing, for instance, remain the most relevant way of data collection and data analytics, of giving feedback to people, and this is all based on feedback. We are using computer linguistics, we are using computer vision tools. In general, this allows to estimate and to reach our people and to get some feedback from them. In fact, we are using this practice too for our projects, given that we need sometimes to work from home, and this is implemented in our digital platforms. That's it from my side. Thank you. Thank you, dear friends. Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Alexander. As far as I got, we have common problems. They are very similar, regardless where we live, on what continent we live. I don't think that our future is very bright. However, we learned how to adapt to this future, to a new reality. I believe that we move more and more into a metaverse, and I'm hoping that we will find the way out. Thank you very much for being with us, dear friends. And thank you for being with us, and thank you for listening.
Транспортно-логистический холдинг «Российские железные дороги». Мы развиваем транспортную инфраструктуру страны, строим новые станции, вокзалы и создаем новые возможности для вашего бизнеса. Лучшие скоростные и высокоскоростные поезда сделают ваше путешествие комфортным и безопасным. Мы – локомотив экономики. Сотни миллионов тонн грузов ежегодно. Развитие науки и социальной сферы – это наш вклад в благосостояние страны и ваша уверенность в завтрашнем дне.
Я новая Hyundai Creta. Hyundai.
Есть история фантастическая. Есть история сказочная. Есть страшная история. А есть история реальная. В Юка всегда реальная история и диагностика автомобилей с пробегом. Юка – официальный сервис Hyundai. Смотрите историю и диагностику автомобиля и покупайте его онлайн.
If you want to stay ahead of the competition, you need the most advanced solutions to transform your comms performance. From media database to social influencers, distribution to monitoring, analytics to insights, Cision's cloud-based tools can help you communicate like never before.
Звонки ВКонтакте для работы. Больше никаких ограничений по времени и платных функций. Звонки ВКонтакте — это разговоры без